Jamie, you know that whole CRT fight that people are having?
Yeah.
Well,
What about it?
yeah, I think that we should talk a little bit more about CMT, which is to say
Hmm.
critical Maccabean theory. I'm Joel Miller,
And I'm Jamie Bennett.
and this is Bad Books of the Bible.
It's a podcast about a collection of books with a curious pedigree and an even stranger legacy. Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
Well, First Maccabees, as we've said before, this is a historical book, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people naively think that that means history, right? That it means that this book describes what happened, but that's not the case. History isn't what happened, it's what people say happened.
Right.
Some statements about the past are more reliable than others, but every statement about the past is partial. It is provisional. It is slightly slanted,
Yeah.
if not extremely slanted, because we are talking about reliance on people's memory, talking about reliance on the available data.
Yeah.
When you have a historian, they're looking at the available data and all the various interpretations of that data that exist up to that point, and then they're making interpretations of their own.
Sure.
And then they are presenting that as a particular picture of what happened.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the band Extreme.
Yeah.
And this album called Three Sides to Every Story
Okay.
had their famous song, More Than Words, which is a real nice little sweet song. I always like to think about that when I think about this question of history being not what happened, but what people say happened, because three sides to every story implies that this person has a perspective and that person has a perspective.
Yeah.
But then there's also what objectively happened, which may not actually be accessible to us.
That's exactly right. I mean, in a sense, it's not accessible. No matter what version of the past you're looking at, it is a version of the past, because the molecules of the world have rearranged themselves ever so slightly since then. And you're basing whatever you're thinking about on a reconstruction of what it was.
Sure.
So that's like the most clear in archaeology, right? People, they go shuffling through the dirt and they see, oh my gosh, look at this axe handle or whatever, axe head.
Yeah.
And then they have to kind of like reimagine how that was used, the situation that it found itself in, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that's true about documents. It's true about people's memories. It's true about everything. All of those are just reconstructions of what happened. And I think the hard thing sometimes to remember, but still true, is that's even true for Holy Scripture. So God is using human storytellers who are working with human memory and human archives, telling human stories. So like when you think about First and Second Samuel, or First and Second Kings, or First and Second Chronicles, or First and Second Maccabees, the authors, whether it's one author, like for instance, First Maccabees, most likely is written by one person. Second Maccabees is actually one version of a story retold by another storyteller.
Sure.
When you look at First Kings or whatever, you're probably looking at a bunch of different editors, compilers, scribes, putting books like that together. Whatever the various ways those books came together, they are being put together to tell a particular story.
Sure.
And that means that story does not include all kinds of other data that may or may not be available to the storyteller, because it doesn't fit within the story that they are trying to tell.
Well, yeah. And in the case of First Maccabees, the author is working from a variety of sources. He's got oral stories and he has temple archives, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we'll come back to this later in today's episode, but the narrator says that he's working specifically from the temple archives because he says the rest of the Acts of John are written in the annals of his high priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
These annals were stored somewhere, right?
Exactly.
This also is an indication that he's writing at the end of John Hyrcanus's reign, or, perhaps shortly afterward.
Right.
That language reflects sort of a literary formula that we find throughout Scripture when scribes are working from written records.
What I find fascinating about that, too, is that he uses this same formula when summing up Judas's reign, but he has to modify it because they're are not archives available for some of that action. You know, what we see particularly in like chapters 3 and 4.
Yeah.
The temple's been destroyed, which means the archives that were inside of it have been damaged, uprooted, thrown out. You know, they're like not available.
Yeah.
And so he says this, he says, now the rest of the acts of Judas and his wars, the brave deeds that he did and his greatness have not been recorded, but they were very many. So he's trying to keep that thematic tie to Israel and Judah's kings that we find in the earlier like royal documents, like First Kings, Second Kings. But he has to like borrow the language of that formula, knowing that he's actually using oral stories, people's recollections of what happened during those periods instead of written documents, because he doesn't have them.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that Second Maccabees mentions that Nehemiah established an archive and that Judas Maccabeus restored this library after, as we've mentioned before, after its destruction by Antiochus IV.
Right.
Given that records were not present for the period of Judas's struggle, you know, the narrator is evidently working from oral stories that are circulating about Judas.
Right, exactly.
It's also possible that the reconstructed nature of the archive explains some of the reconstructed documents themselves that we see in the text.
In the book, right.
So some scholars say that this or that letter in the book seems fabricated. But, you know, I mean, it seems just as possible to imagine that these are really attempts at faithfully restoring from memory what a document thought to be in the archive might have been or said.
Like there's a cultural memory of something having happened and the author's going to reconstruct that.
That's exactly it.
You know, you see that in other histories, you know, written in the ancient world, Thucydides and others, you know, they are not presenting documents necessarily. They are not presenting like when a speech is given, maybe somebody remember that, you know, like pretty exhaustively.
Yeah.
But the author is still reconstructing at least parts of those speeches, because nobody could remember a word for word rendition of, you know, so-and-so's speech.
And even when you think about the way the crowd responds, we pointed out in the last episode, it said that the crowd said loudly in one voice, this long statement.
Right, exactly.
It's not like the crowd sat around and rehearsed that. The narrator was not trying to suggest that they all shouted one line.
Right.
The narrator is suggesting this is the sense of what the people wanted, what they were crying out about. So these things are meant not to capture verbatim the exact thing that's said. They're meant to capture the essence of what happened.
Right, exactly. You know, this book is replete with documents, right? So we know that they're using these documents, letters and inscriptions, plus, you know, all the other records not explicitly cited by the author as he's putting this together. And he's using all of these sources to stitch together this dynastic story of the Maccabean family. What will later, in fact, with the reign of John Hyrcanus and afterwards, be called the Hasmoneans.
Yeah.
And this book is fundamentally about supporting their claims to rule in Judea.
Yeah.
It's why some people have even called him, the author of First Maccabees, the Hasmonean propagandist.
Oh, wow.
So it's a one-sided history meant to elevate the story of the Maccabean family, the Hasmonean dynasty, to demonstrate that they had rightful rule over Judea.
Right. How best to close First Maccabees, but with yet another Antiochus.
Another Antiochus? I mean, we're up to what now?
6 or 7, right?
Yeah, amazing. I tell you what, these Seleucids, they're not terribly original. You know, like everybody's named after everybody else.
Hey, they're committed to tradition. You know,
that's what it is. Okay, I'll get it.
With Demetrius II now out of the picture, his brother Antiochus the seventh, he is eager to regain the family throne. So he sends a letter, quote, from the islands of the sea. I love that phrase, addressed to Simon, who is identified as the high priest and ethnarch to the nation of the Jews. And we mentioned this idea of ethnarch, like he's the ruler of this particular people.
Yeah. Can we read that letter?
Yeah.
Can you do that?
Let's do it. Whereas certain scoundrels have gained control of the kingdom of our ancestors.
I love that. Certain scoundrels. Which ones? These ones.
Dirty, rotten ones.
These certain scoundrels.
And I intend to lay claim to the kingdom so that I may restore it as it formerly was, and have recruited a host of mercenary troops. He's equipped. There we go. And have equipped warships, and intend to make a landing in the country so that I may proceed against those who have destroyed our country and those who have devastated many cities in my kingdom. Now, therefore, I confirm to you all the tax remissions that the kings before me have granted you, and a release from all the other payments from which they have released you. So he's a little upset, but he's also going to sweeten the pot here. And he goes on to talk about other benefits. He even includes, and this is really important, the right to mint money, maintain the temple and their fortresses, and have debts forgiven for all time.
Yeah.
Minting money is a big deal because it essentially means that Judea is an independent kingdom.
Yeah. He's like recognizing their independence in that statement.
And it says, when we gain control of our kingdom, we will bestow great honor on you and your nation and the temple, so that your glory will become manifest in all the earth. So that there's an arrangement being set up here where they're essentially independent. They're running their own money system.
Yeah.
But there's a relationship with him that he is going to be committed to them.
He's going after the Seleucid throne, and he wants Simon on his side. This is totally a quid pro quo.
That's exactly it.
After that letter gets sent, Antiochus VII makes his move. Now, this is bad news for Trypho.
Yeah.
He schemed his way to the throne, and unfortunately, he didn't really earn himself any favor among the people for having done this. So the army, it turns out, where they go, that's where the country goes. And they like the idea of serving under Antiochus more than Trypho. So they switch sides, leaving Trypho just a handful of soldiers,
Oops.
Easy come, easy go. Antiochus then chases Trypho to the city of Dor, which is by the sea, and he surrounds them there. And he's got troops coming in from the land. He's got warships out in the sea, keeping him from leaving. Trypho is trapped.
Meanwhile, Simon's envoy to Rome has returned with good news. So the consul of the Romans, Lucius, he sent messages to the kings surrounding Judea. And the narrator presents the one sent to King Ptolemy in Egypt. And Lucius says, we have decided to write to the kings and countries that they should not seek their harm or make war against them and their cities and their country, or make alliance with those who war against them.
And the them in this case is Simon and his people.
That's right.
Yeah.
Simon, it's worth mentioning, he sent a gold shield along with the envoy to Rome as a gift. It says that this thing weighed like 1,000. What is it? Minus.
I'll tell you what, I meant to go look this up before we started recording to tell you what that actually meant. But suffice it to say, 1,000 gold minas is not minus. It is plus. It is big. So that's what we know in a very unscholarly attempt to tell you how much that is.
Well, and we do know that the letter says that it seemed good to accept the shield from them.
Yeah.
So it must have been worth something.
Right. It wasn't trash. This was a nice gift. They're not going to be re-gifting this one at whatever holiday.
Right. Exactly. It continues. Therefore, if any scoundrels have fled to you from their country.
The scoundrels, man, they are at it again.
Got to watch out for those scoundrels. Hand them over to the high priest Simon, so that he may punish them according to their law. In other words, Simon is the rightful ruler of Judea as recognized by Rome.
Yeah.
And Rome is putting everyone else on notice that they don't want any funny business.
Nope. The narrator says, in fact, that the same letter was sent to kings all over. Basically, we're talking about really the states and cities that are like under Roman suzerainty.
Sure.
Is that the way we say that?
I think so.
Basically, people that have a deal with Rome, back to, we talked about George Washington several episodes ago. These would be entangling alliances that work for the benefit of everybody right up until they don't. And And so Rome is saying, hey, all you other people that we consider kind of like our children out there,
Yeah.
you gotta treat these people like they're in charge because they're in charge.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Antiochus did not get that message.
Yeah. He's not even mentioned in the list of rulers who received the letter, and his subsequent actions bear this out.
Essentially, Antiochus's efforts to oust Trypho from Dor, I mean, this guy's dug in like a tick in a dog's ear. They continue, and he besieges the city a second time. Now, it does say that it's a second time, which means he's already tried it and he's already failed. So, Antiochus, we can say he's persistent, but he's not terribly lucky.
Sure.
He sends his men around the city. They talk about siege engines. They're going after him. And Simon, he wants to help. So he sends a couple thousand soldiers. These are like choice soldiers from his own troops to help with the siege. But interestingly, Antiochus refuses to receive them. So all those nice words from Antiochus a little bit ago, there's a catch, and the catch is being revealed right now. It says, the narrator says, he broke all the agreements he formerly had made with Simon, and he became estranged from him. And I think what's going on here is summarized nicely by the Navarre Bible. There's a note there that says this: now that Antiochus is in Palestine and sees that Trypho will not cause him any trouble, he retracts the concessions that he made to Simon, and he rejects Simon's offer for help. This is basically like, it turns out I don't need you.
Sure.
Never mind.
Right.
I'm going to basically come after you later, and I want to reserve the right to come after you later now that I've got Trypho basically hold up. So what's sticking in his craw? It has a lot to do with the fact that the Maccabees had taken Joppa.
Right.
So he sends a messenger. Let me just try this name. Athenobius.
I like it.
I think it's Athenobius.
I think it is.
You know what? The jury says Athenobius. He sends Athenobius with demands: either hand over Joppa and the other cities that Simon and his brothers have seized, or pay up.
Yeah. And Athenobius brings the message to Simon. Like, he's blown away by the wealth that he sees on display in Simon's palace. Lots of gold and silver. And suffice it to say, he was more impressed by Simon's wealth than Simon was with his message.
Yes.
Simon says he's only taken back the ancestral lands and cities their enemies have stolen. As for Joppa and Gazara, which really weren't originally ancestral lands, he offers to pay Antiochus, but only 1/5 of what Antiochus had demanded. Athenobius leaves in a huff and reports back to Antiochus with a special note about how much wealth he had seen on display in Judea.
This is like kind of a used car sale gone wrong. Like there's a deal happening, there's some haggling beginning, and unfortunately, Simon, he's wearing a cut of clothes that's just a little too nice to say, I need a deal. I need something a little bit cheaper than what you're asking. So when he says, I'll pay you 1/5 of what you're asking, like, Athenobius is actually insulted by that instead of thinking, all right, well, we can cut a deal. And he storms out.
Yeah. And while all that's going on, Trypho finagles his escape. So Antiochus decides to go after Trypho. So he gives one of his commanders, Syndibius, the job of putting Simon in his place. And he sends him to invade Judea.
Here's what the narrator says about it. Syndibius came to Jamnia and began to provoke the people and invade Judea and take the people captive and kill them. He built up Kedron and stationed horsemen and troops there so that they might go out and make raids along the highways of Judea, as the king had ordered him. Now, Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, who we met in the last episode, he tells his father what's happening. Now, this is, I think, really fitting, but Simon basically, he says, I am just too dang old to keep fighting.
Yeah.
But no big deal. He's got total confidence in John. And he says, take my place and my brothers and go out and fight for our nation. And may the help that comes from heaven be with you. And we can say this, it was with him.
Yeah.
John mustered a force of 20,000 footmen and cavalry. They march to Modein, which is fitting since that's really where the first confrontation of the book begins.
Yeah.
It's also where the family tomb and the monuments are located.
Yeah. That's an important touchstone.
Yeah, exactly. So in fact, this is a perfect example of what we were talking about at the beginning of the show, about how a author presents the facts in such a way as to elicit a certain response, to create a certain picture, and then elicit a certain response from his readers.
Yeah.
He's drawing attention to the location precisely because this is so central to the people of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
That it is this is where the Maccabean thing got started. So it's going to end where the thing got started.
Yeah. What happens next even underscores that, because it says they marched into the plain where a stream divides the two forces. And John's men they kind of seem afraid to cross the stream. So we've talked before about how cinematic this book can be. Here's another one of those sort of made for Hollywood moments. The narrator takes it as a chance to highlight John's bravery.
Right. Yep.
And he communicates everything you need to know about the next generation of Maccabean courage and leadership in just one sentence. It says, he saw that the soldiers were afraid to cross the stream, so he crossed over first. And when his troops saw him, they crossed over after him.
It's a perfect example of how constructed the story is. He sets the battle in Modein. Presumably that's exactly where it happened, but he highlights that fact as a way of highlighting what he's trying to do with telling the story of the Maccabees.
Yeah.
And he highlights John's bravery at the place of the family seat precisely so he can show that John is now taken over for the people that came before, from Judas, from Jonathan, from Simon, his father.
Yeah.
So this is a way of constructing a narrative so that he drives home a particular point.
Yeah.
That the rule of John is actually a rightful rule. He is the rightful inheritor of everything that came before in the Maccabean family.
Yeah, there's a leadership backbone that runs in the family.
Yep.
And he shows that to us over and over with each member that takes leadership.
It's funny too, because the battle itself is kind of anticlimactic, right? It's
right.
I guess that's to be expected. The climax of the story already happened.
Yeah.
Right. That was in the last chapter. That was when Simon gutted the citadel and basically he establishes himself. He gets rid of what's happening with the citadel, the Acra, the thing that had been kind of poisoning the land since the beginning of the book. Now we're in the resolution of the story.
Yeah.
And this moment is relayed principally to show that the nation is in good hands. John's men, they blow their trumpets. The enemy tucks their tail and run. John pursues and slays a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And then Syndibius hides out in his fortress while John heads home victorious. I mean, like that's boom. And it happens in just a couple of verses. Like that's all it needed.
As the next episode unfolds, John seems to be at his base in Gazara.
Mm-hmm.
And Simon's son-in-law, Ptolemy, decides he wants to seize control of the country.
This can't be good.
Yeah. The narrator says his heart was lifted up. Now, this is a direct callback to Alexander the Great. He says the same thing about him in chapter 1.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, the narrator is trying to communicate that it's the same prideful, arrogant, destructive spirit. It's not gone. It's actually on the loose.
Right.
Ptolemy throws a party for his father and two of his brothers-in-law, Mattathias and Judas. And while everyone is feasting and Simon and his sons are in their cups, Ptolemy and his men attack and kill them. You know, they're vulnerable. They're having a great time.
Right.
And he comes in. So, says the narrator, he committed an act of great treachery and returned evil for good.
And we might ask why. I mean, this is his son-in-law, right? Like,
yeah,
this is kind of shocking. In fact, it says when John gets the news, he is shocked. We're all shocked that this would happen.
Yeah.
So what's going on here? We've already talked about the fact that there are some rifts that have appeared in the country. First, there's the Hellenizing Jews that were not fans of the Maccabees, not from day one, right?
Yeah.
These, to use our example of Tories versus Patriots, These are the Tories that have disliked the Patriots and all they've stood for all along, and especially how they were treated by those same Patriots.
Yeah.
Next, there is the alienated family of the high priesthood that the Maccabean crew, they came in and they basically took over the high priesthood while these guys had a pretty good claim to that.
Yeah.
And so there's some bad blood there. And the Navarre Bible basically says this, to quote, Ptolemy may have thought he could gain advantage from that disaffection.
Mm-hmm.
So if he is, as the text says, his heart is lifted up, he sees a rift, he thinks he can take advantage of it. It's basically just a question of one scheming guy. We've encountered lots of them in this book. One scheming guy who decides to take advantage of a weakness or a potential weakness to put himself in charge.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the narrator reports this situation, this crime, matter of factly. Like,
right.
It's very serious what happened, but there's a reason why it warrants little indignation at this point in the story. And that is that we're at the end.
Right.
The action has shifted to the new ruler, to John.
He's not going to dwell on the claims of these dissenters because in a real sense, he already has, right?
Right.
The book of Maccabees is one great big argument since the beginning of the book that the Maccabean family are the legitimate rulers of Judah. So he's already said his piece about these dissenters. He's already said, you guys lose. He's writing at the end of John's reign or just after that.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the book isn't even about Judas Maccabeus or Jonathan or Simon or even John.
Sure.
It's really about the Hasmonean claim to be the rightful rulers of Judea.
To me, that really comes out at the end of the story because it almost feels anticlimactic the way the book ends.
Right.
But really, the book is setting up something.
Mm-hmm.
It's a narrative to explain how we got here for the narrator.
Right.
And to legitimize what is happening going forward.
Yeah.
It's a history with a purpose. Now, the story ended when the Seleucid citadel was destroyed. And of course, worship was finally and totally restored. The rest of this really is just a mop up.
Yeah. That anticlimactic thing kind of like moves all the way through the rest of the few verses here that end it. You know, like when Ptolemy sends his men to kill John, John has already got news. Turns out that the word runs faster than assassins. And, you know, he says he's shocked, but he meets the killers and then he kills them. He beats them to the punch. It's like, wow. It barely warrants anything other than a quick mention to wrap that up. Between John's handy defeat of Sendibius and his scheming brother-in-law, the narrator is basically just saying everything's returned to normal, such as it is,
right?
Now that John's in charge.
Yeah, and he concludes the narrative by saying simply, the rest of the acts of John and his wars and the brave deeds that he did and the building of the walls that he completed and his achievements are written in the annals of his high priesthood from the time that he became high priest after his father. This closing line is revealing in a couple of ways.
Yeah, we've already said this at the beginning, so let's just reiterate this. The style is taken directly from the summary statements of rulers that we find in Kings and Chronicles.
Yeah.
But it is slightly different, and it's slightly different in an interesting way. These are not palace archives. They're temple archives.
Yeah, that's right.
Power has shifted to the temple, especially given the close connection made by these Maccabean rulers to that, because they were not only the political leaders and the military leaders, but they were also the religious leaders.
Yeah. And after this point, we're going to call them the Hasmonean dynasty. Mm-hmm. And John Hyrcanus will eventually side with the priestly Sadducees against the up-and-coming Pharisees.
Yeah, this is a good example of how power has shifted to the temple. The Sadducees are, you know, like more entrenched there than are the Pharisees, who are essentially laymen. This explains the later rabbinic disfavor of the book of First Maccabees.
Yeah.
So the forebears of the rabbis were the Pharisees, and the Pharisees were not allied with the Sadducees. They were in fact foes. We see that obviously in the New Testament. You got these two factions. They're not big fans of each other. And the rabbis, the heirs of the Pharisees, they're the ones who essentially curate the books that become the Hebrew Old Testament. But this book existed in Greek and was carried forward in Greek copies of the Old Testament that the rabbis didn't use and didn't care about, but Christians did.
Yeah.
And so as a result, Christians are reading that book and trying to figure out how to apply it and use it. And of course, they did.
Yeah.
And that's why it's in Christian Bibles and not in Jewish Bibles, even though it is a thoroughly Jewish book.
Of course, that's all fodder for another podcast.
Yes, indeed.
Because the book of First Maccabees is now closed. And of course, this season of the podcast is not closed yet, though. We have a couple of episodes left, and you're not going to want to miss those. Go to badbooksofthebible.com. Be sure to sign up for our email list so that you do not miss an episode. Also, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. You can write to us at badbooks@ancientfaith.com, and we read everything we receive. That's right. We read it all.
Everything.
I'm Jamie Bennett.
And I'm Joel Miller.
And you've been listening to Bad Books of the Bible,
a production of Ancient Faith Radio. Come back next week when we talk about everything we learned or loved about First Maccabees.
Beautiful.